June 17, 2023. Rural Pennsylvania, approximately 15 miles south of the New York border. A location where forests have reclaimed what was once industrial land, where nature has erased the traces of early 20th century commerce, where the steel rails that once connected America's cities now lie buried beneath decades of vegetation. The Northeastern Railway Preservation Society, a volunteer organization dedicated to documenting and preserving railway history, had been conducting a project throughout 2023, cataloging abandoned railway lines before they disappeared entirely. Led by David Anderson, a retired railway engineer with 40 years of experience, the team used historical maps, old company records, and geographic surveys to locate forgotten pieces of America's railway infrastructure. Many railway lines that had been vital in the early 1900s had been abandoned by mid-century, their tracks removed for scrap or simply left to rust. Spur lines, short branch lines connecting to main routes, were particularly vulnerable to being forgotten. These spurs had served lumber mills, coal mines, factories, and private sidings for wealthy individuals and companies. When the businesses closed or railway economics changed, the spurs were often simply abandoned and forgotten. On June 17th, David and his team were following an 1897 railway survey map that showed a spur line branching off from what had once been the Thompson Railway Company's Northeastern route. The map indicated the spur ran approximately 2 miles into forested land to reach a private siding. Historical records suggested this siding had been built for the company's owner, Christopher Thompson, to store his private rail car when not in use. The team had difficulty locating the spur line initially. Modern satellite imagery showed only forest, but by using GPS coordinates derived from the historical map and physically searching the area, they found traces. A slight depression in the forest floor running in a straight line. Occasional pieces of rusted iron barely visible beneath leaves and soil. The subtle signs that trained eyes could recognize as a forgotten railway grade. Following this trace through dense forest for nearly a mile, the team emerged into a small clearing. And there, almost completely hidden by over a century of vegetation growth, sat a railway car. Not a modern freight car, but an ornate private passenger car from the early 1900s, the kind of luxury rail car that wealthy industrialists used for business and personal travel. The rail car was in severe condition after more than a century of abandonment. The exterior paint had long since vanished, replaced by rust and corrosion. Windows were either broken or so opaque with grime and mineral deposits that seeing inside was impossible. Vegetation had grown up around and even through parts of the undercarriage. The wheels, still on the rails, were rusted solid, but the structure, built from heavy steel and hardwood, had survived. David immediately recognized the historical significance. Private rail cars from this era were rare, and finding one abandoned and forgotten was extraordinary. He photographed the exterior extensively, documenting every detail. The car bore traces of ornate decoration, scrollwork near the roofline, brass fixtures that had corroded green, the remnants of what had once been luxury. But what made David's discovery transition from historically interesting to potentially tragic was what happened when the team carefully forced open the corroded door to examine the interior. Inside the private sleeping compartment at the rear of the car, partially covered by fallen debris and the remains of deteriorated furnishings, were human skeletal remains. David immediately withdrew and contacted Pennsylvania State Police. By that evening, the remote siding had been secured. By the following day, forensic teams from the State Medical Examiner's Office and railway historians were on site. Over the next week, The remains and the rail car would be carefully examined and documented. The skeletal remains were partially preserved, with many smaller bones missing or scattered. The position suggested the individual had died in the rail car and remained largely undisturbed, though a century of environmental factors had taken their toll. After 104 years, soft tissues were entirely gone. Clothing had deteriorated to fragments barely recognizable as fabric, but some bones and metal objects had survived the passage of time. Among the remains, investigators found several items: a pocket watch, heavily corroded but still recognizable, with engraving that became visible after careful cleaning. CJT, a signet ring, gold, heavily tarnished. What appeared to be the corroded remains of spectacles, metal buttons and fasteners from clothing that had long since disintegrated. The rail car itself provided clues. Despite severe deterioration, the car's builder's plate was still partially legible, indicating it had been constructed in 1908 by a Pennsylvania railcar manufacturer. Historical records showed that Christopher James Thompson, owner of the Thompson Railway Company, had commissioned a private railcar from that manufacturer in that year. The investigation to identify the remains would take months and involve extensive historical research and limited forensic analysis. But the preliminary connection was clear. This railcar belonged to Christopher Thompson, and these skeletal remains were likely his. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in November 1919 involves a powerful railway magnate, a journey that never reached its destination, and a private railcar that sat forgotten for over a century. By the end, you'll understand how one of the Northeast's most influential businessmen vanished without a trace, and why it took 104 years to find him. The questions investigators faced were daunting. How did Christopher Thompson end up dead in his own railcar on a remote, forgotten siding? Who knew about this location? And how did a railway magnate's disappearance remain unsolved for over a century? Christopher James Thompson was 58 years old in November 1919, at the height of his influence in the Northeastern Railway industry. He stood 6 feet tall, with a solid build that had thickened over the years. His hair had gone from dark brown to iron gray, and he wore it combed back in the style of successful men of that era. He favored well-tailored suits, carried a gold pocket watch his father had given him, and wore a signet ring bearing his family crest. Those who knew him described him as commanding, a man who made decisions quickly and expected them to be executed without question. Christopher had been born in 1861 in upstate New York, the son of a railway worker who maintained tracks for one of the regional lines. Growing up in a railway family meant Christopher understood the industry from an early age. He'd seen his father work long hours in dangerous conditions for modest pay. He'd watched railway companies grow wealthy while workers struggled, and he'd decided early that he would be on the management side of the industry, not the labor side. He'd received a decent education for someone of his background, attending a local school through age 16. But his real education came from working in the railway industry. At 17, Christopher took a job as a clerk in a railway company office, learning the business side of the industry. He was intelligent, ambitious, and willing to work harder than anyone else. He studied railway economics, learned about routing and scheduling, understood the financial aspects of railway operations. By his mid-20s, Christopher had saved enough money to make small investments in railway ventures. He bought shares in small regional lines, learned to negotiate deals, began building a network of business contacts. In 1892, at age 31, he made his first major acquisition, purchasing a struggling short-line railway that connected several small towns to a larger regional line. He restructured the operation, made it profitable, and sold it 5 years later for a substantial profit. That success gave Christopher the capital to expand. Over the next 2 decades, he acquired multiple small railway lines, consolidated them into a larger operation, built new connections, and by 1910 had created the Thompson Railway Company, a significant Northeastern railway network operating in Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. The company transported freight and passengers, owned substantial railway infrastructure, and generated considerable profits. In 1886, Christopher had married Eleanor Mitchell, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family. Their marriage brought Christopher social respectability and connections to established business circles. They had 2 sons, James, born in 1887, and William, born in 1890. By 1919, both sons were adults working in the family business. Christopher's success had made him wealthy. He owned a mansion in Philadelphia, a country estate in the Pocono Mountains, and various investment properties. His personal fortune was estimated at several $1,000,000, equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. But his wealth came with enemies and complications. The railway industry in the early 20th century was intensely competitive and often ruthless. Companies fought for routes, for freight contracts, for passengers. They manipulated rates, formed cartels, bribed officials, and sometimes used violence against competitors. Christopher had participated in these practices, viewing them as necessary business tactics. He'd driven competitors out of business, acquired struggling companies at fire sale prices, and built his empire partly on the failures of others. By 1919, Christopher also faced labor unrest. The period following World War I saw significant strikes and labor organizing in the railway industry. Workers demanded better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. Christopher, like many railway owners of that era, viewed labor organizers as threats to profitability and dealt with them harshly. This created resentment and, some believed, potential threats to his safety. Christopher owned a private railcar, a luxury passenger car he'd commissioned in 1908. This car represented the pinnacle of railway luxury for that era. Ornate woodwork, plush furnishings, a private sleeping compartment, a small office area, and facilities that allowed him to travel in comfort while conducting business. He used this car regularly, having it coupled to scheduled trains when he needed to travel, or having locomotives pull it directly for private trips. November 14, 1919, was a Friday. Christopher had planned a weekend business trip to Albany, New York, to meet with officials of a railway company he was considering acquiring. He told his staff he would take his private rail car, have it coupled to a northbound train, and spend the weekend in Albany before returning Monday. That Friday afternoon, Christopher left his company headquarters in Philadelphia around 3 p.m. His secretary, Margaret Wilson, later testified that he'd seemed normal, focused on the upcoming negotiations, but not concerned or worried. He'd taken his briefcase containing business documents, told staff he'd see them Monday, and departed. Christopher's private rail car was stored on a company siding near the Philadelphia headquarters, when not in use. Company records showed that on November 14th, a locomotive had been dispatched to move the private car to the main line to be coupled to the northbound train. But this is where the timeline becomes murky and ultimately tragic. The private car never appeared at the main line. It never was coupled to any northbound train. And Christopher James Thompson was never seen alive again. November 14th, 1919. A Friday afternoon in Philadelphia. The weather that day was recorded as overcast and cool, typical for November in the Northeast. Temperature was approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit. No rain, no conditions that would have affected railway operations. Christopher Thompson left his company headquarters at approximately 3 p.m. Multiple employees saw him depart, carrying his briefcase and wearing his winter coat. He was in a good mood, according to witnesses, anticipating a successful business deal in Albany. The Thompson Railway Company's headquarters was located in an industrial area of Philadelphia, with direct railway access. A private siding adjacent to the building allowed the company to store railway cars, including Christopher's private car. This siding connected to the company's main line through a series of switches and short connecting tracks. At approximately 3:30 p.m., according to company records, Christopher personally gave instructions to yard workers to have his private car moved. He specified that the car should be taken to the main line junction, where it would be coupled to the 4:45 p.m. northbound passenger train. This was standard procedure when Christopher traveled. A locomotive was assigned to move the private car. The engineer, a man named Robert Sullivan, who'd worked for the company for 15 years, later testified that he'd received the movement order and had prepared to execute it. At approximately 3:45 p.m., Sullivan's locomotive was positioned to couple with Christopher's private car. But here's where accounts become unclear. Sullivan testified that he'd coupled to the car and was preparing to move it when he received a message, delivered by a yard worker whose identity was never definitively established, that the movement had been changed. The message stated that Christopher had altered his plans and the private car should be taken to a different location for later departure. Sullivan, accustomed to last-minute changes in plans for executive movements, followed the instructions. He testified that he'd been directed to take the private car out, onto a secondary line, then follow a spur that branched off approximately 3 miles from the headquarters. He'd assumed this was related to some business matter. Perhaps Christopher wanted to inspect something or meet someone at a remote location before departing for Albany. Sullivan moved the private car out onto the secondary line and followed the spur as directed. He testified that the spur led into increasingly rural and forested terrain. After approximately 2 miles on the spur, he reached what appeared to be a dead-end siding in a clearing surrounded by trees. The message had indicated he should leave the car there and return with his locomotive. Finding this strange, but assuming it was part of some plan he wasn't privy to, Sullivan uncoupled the private car, left it on the siding, and returned to the company yard with his locomotive. He arrived back at the yard around 5 p.m. When he reported what he'd done, the yard supervisor was confused. No one had authorized any such movement. There was no reason for Christopher's private car to be taken to a remote siding. Attempts were immediately made to contact Christopher, but this was 1919. No cell phones, limited telephone access. His office tried calling his home, but Eleanor Thompson said he hadn't returned home and she'd expected him to be on his way to Albany by then. By 6 p.m. Friday evening, it was clear something was wrong. Christopher had planned to be on the 4:45 p.m. train to Albany. He hadn't boarded. His private car was somewhere on a remote siding, according to Sullivan's testimony. But which siding? Sullivan wasn't entirely certain of the exact location, as he'd been following directions given in the mysterious message and hadn't been paying close attention to landmarks in unfamiliar territory. Saturday morning, November 15th, the Thompson Railway Company organized search teams. They attempted to trace Sullivan's route from the previous day, but the secondary line had multiple spurs and sidings, many no longer actively used. Finding the specific location where Sullivan had left the private car proved difficult. By Sunday evening, Eleanor Thompson reported her husband officially missing. By Monday morning, local police and railway security were conducting a major investigation. The investigation into Christopher Thompson's disappearance became one of the most puzzling missing persons cases in the Northeastern United States in the 1920s. Local police, railway investigators, and eventually federal agents became involved. The critical question was, where was Christopher's private rail car? If they could find the car, they'd likely find Christopher or at least clues to what happened to him. But locating the car proved extraordinarily difficult. Engineer Robert Sullivan was questioned extensively. He repeated his account. He'd received instructions to take the private car to a remote siding. He'd followed a spur line into forested territory, left the car there, and returned. But when asked to lead investigators to the location, Sullivan had difficulty. The area he'd traveled through was unfamiliar to him. In the dark of evening, when he'd returned, he hadn't noted landmarks carefully. He could provide a general direction, but not a precise location. Search teams spent weeks combing spur lines and remote sidings throughout the Thompson Railway Company's network. They found several abandoned or rarely used sidings, but none contained Christopher's private rail car. The car seemed to have vanished completely. Investigators examined the mysterious message Sullivan claimed to have received. Who delivered it? Sullivan described a yard worker he didn't recognize, which wasn't unusual in a large operation where temporary workers were common. But no one came forward to admit delivering such a message. No one in the company's management had authorized any change to Christopher's travel plans. Several theories emerged. Kidnapping. Perhaps Christopher had been kidnapped, and the mysterious message was part of a plan to isolate him. But no ransom demand ever materialized. Weeks passed, then months, with no contact from anyone claiming to hold Christopher. Business rivals. Christopher had enemies. Perhaps a competitor had orchestrated his disappearance. But investigators couldn't find evidence connecting any specific rival to the disappearance. And why would rivals want to make Christopher disappear rather than simply kill him or ruin him financially? Labor organizers. 1919 saw significant labor unrest in the railway industry. Perhaps radical elements had targeted Christopher, but investigation of labor organizations found no evidence of involvement. Most labor leaders condemned violence and denied any knowledge of Christopher's disappearance. Voluntary disappearance. Perhaps Christopher had staged his own disappearance to escape financial problems or personal issues. But examination of his finances showed the Thompson Railway Company was profitable. His personal life appeared stable. There was no apparent reason for him to abandon his wealth, family, and position. The mysterious message Sullivan received was perhaps the most troubling clue. If someone had deliberately lured Christopher's private car to a remote location, that suggested premeditation. But who? And why had no trace of Christopher or the car been found despite extensive searches? By early 1920, investigators had to admit they'd reached a dead end. Christopher James Thompson had vanished. His private rail car had vanished. Despite months of searching, interviewing hundreds of people, examining thousands of documents, no explanation had emerged. In 1921, the Thompson Railway Company was restructured. Christopher's sons, James and William, took over management. They kept the company operating, but without their father's leadership, it gradually declined. In 1926, 7 years after Christopher's disappearance, Eleanor Thompson petitioned to have him declared legally dead. The court granted the petition. In 1932, the Thompson Railway Company was sold to a larger competitor. The new owners merged it into their existing operations, and the Thompson name disappeared from the railway industry. The various lines, sidings, and infrastructure that Christopher had built were either incorporated into the new company's network or abandoned. Among the infrastructure abandoned were numerous small spur lines and sidings that had served purposes no longer relevant. These spurs, cut through forests to reach now closed lumber mills or abandoned industrial sites, were simply left to nature. The rails might be removed for scrap, or might be left to rust. Either way, these forgotten pieces of railway infrastructure gradually vanished beneath vegetation and were erased from corporate memory and even from maps. And on one of these forgotten sidings, Christopher Thompson's private railcar sat undisturbed for decades, hidden by forest growth, unknown to the world, waiting 104 years to reveal its secret. The 104 years between Christopher Thompson's disappearance in 1919 and the discovery of his remains in 2023 saw the complete transformation of America's railway system and the world beyond it. The railway-dominated transportation of the 1920s gave way to automobiles and highways, then to air travel. Railways, which had once been the lifelines of American commerce, became less central to the economy. Many smaller railway companies failed or were absorbed by larger ones. Thousands of miles of track were abandoned. The Thompson family's connection to the railway industry ended with the sale of the company in 1932. Eleanor Thompson lived until 1947, dying without ever knowing what happened to her husband. Her sons, James and William, pursued other business interests. The Thompson name, once prominent in Northeastern railway circles, faded from public memory. By the late 20th century, the story of Christopher Thompson's disappearance was remembered only by railway history enthusiasts as an unsolved mystery from the industry's golden age. Occasionally, a history book or article would mention it. The railway magnate who vanished in 1919, never found, never explained. The physical infrastructure of the Thompson Railway Company's network underwent its own transformation. Main lines that were profitable continued operating under new ownership. Secondary lines were either maintained or abandoned based on economic viability. Many spur lines, especially those serving isolated locations or industries that no longer existed, were simply abandoned. When a railway line is abandoned, several things can happen. Sometimes the rails are removed and sold for scrap metal, leaving just the grade, the leveled and graded path where the tracks once lay. Sometimes the rails are left in place to rust away gradually. In either case, nature reclaims the corridor. Trees and vegetation grow, covering the tracks or grade. Within a few decades, a railway line can become nearly invisible, especially in heavily forested areas. This is what happened to the spur line leading to the siding where Christopher's private railcar sat. The spur had been built in the 1890s to serve a lumber operation. When the lumber company closed in the 1920s, the spur lost its primary purpose. By the 1930s, it was rarely used. By the 1940s, it was abandoned. The rails may have been removed for wartime scrap metal drives, or they may have been left to rust. Either way, forest reclaimed the corridor. By the 1980s and 90s, the spur existed only on old maps and in forgotten corporate records. The siding itself, the small clearing where Sullivan had left Christopher's private railcar in November 1919, became even more obscure. It wasn't on any main route. It served no purpose anyone remembered. Trees grew around and eventually over the railcar. Vegetation covered the rails. The siding became invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it, with historical maps and GPS coordinates. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, railway preservation became a growing movement. Enthusiasts recognized that pieces of railway history were disappearing. Organizations formed to document abandoned lines, preserve historic equipment, and maintain railway heritage. One such organization was the Northeastern Railway Preservation Society, founded in 1995. David Anderson joined the Preservation Society in 2005 after retiring from a 40-year career as a railway engineer. He'd developed a particular interest in documenting abandoned infrastructure, the forgotten spurs, sidings, and branch lines that had once been vital parts of larger networks but had vanished from modern awareness. In 2023, David proposed an ambitious project, systematically documenting abandoned Thompson Railway Company infrastructure using historical maps and modern GPS technology. The Thompson Railway Company's records, preserved in various archives, included detailed maps from the late 1800s and early 1900s showing every spur and siding in their network. June 17, 2023. David Anderson and his Preservation Society team were working through their systematic documentation of forgotten Thompson Railway infrastructure. They'd been successful in locating several abandoned grades and sidings, photographing and mapping them before the traces disappeared entirely. On this particular day, they were investigating a spur line shown on an 1897 company map. The map indicated the spur branched off from a secondary line that still existed as a lightly used freight route. The spur itself, according to the map, ran approximately 2 miles into what was now state forest land, terminating at a small siding labeled on the map simply as Private CT. David suspected CT referred to Christopher Thompson, and that this might have been the location where his private railcar was stored when not in use. If so, finding this location would be historically significant, even if nothing remained after 126 years. Using GPS coordinates derived from the old map, David's team entered the forest at approximately the location where the spur should branch off. Finding the actual trace of the old railway grade required careful observation. But David's experienced eye recognized the signs: a subtle, linear depression running through the forest, occasionally visible beneath leaf litter. The team followed this trace, using metal detectors to locate buried rails or railway hardware that confirmed they were following an old railway corridor. After approximately a mile of careful progress through dense forest, the corridor became more visible. The grade widened slightly, suggesting they were approaching the siding. And then, in a clearing that had become slightly less overgrown due to the underlying railway ballast preventing some tree growth, they saw it. At first glance, it looked like a large rusted metal structure, almost completely obscured by vines and vegetation. But as David approached and began examining it, he realized what it was: a railway passenger car from the early 1900s, still sitting on rusted rails that were barely visible beneath soil and vegetation. The car was in severe condition after more than a century of abandonment. The exterior had rusted extensively. The roof showed signs of partial collapse. Windows were broken, or so degraded they were opaque. But the basic structure, built from heavy steel framing and hardwood components, had survived. David's immediate assessment was that this was an extraordinary find: a private rail car from the golden age of railway travel, abandoned and forgotten. But as he documented the exterior, he noticed something on the side of the car, barely visible beneath rust and corrosion. When he carefully cleaned a small area, ornate lettering became partially visible, what appeared to be initials or a monogram, and his heart began racing when he thought he could make out T-20KT as part of the E lettering. The Preservation Society's protocol required them to document exteriors only and not enter structures unless necessary for safety assessment. But the railcar's condition concerned David. The roof was partially collapsed, and the structure might become completely unsalvageable if not documented soon. After careful consideration and safety precautions, David decided they needed to force open the corroded door and examine the interior. The door was rusted shut, requiring careful work, with tools to open without causing structural damage. When it finally opened, The interior was dark, musty, and heavily deteriorated. David entered cautiously with flashlights. The interior layout was visible despite deterioration. A central corridor, small compartments on one side, and, at the rear, what had been a private sleeping compartment. The furnishings had mostly deteriorated or collapsed, but traces remained showing this had been a luxury car. And in the sleeping compartment, partially covered by fallen debris, David saw skeletal remains. He immediately withdrew and contacted Pennsylvania State Police. The remote location made response challenging, but by evening, authorities had reached the site. The following day, forensic teams arrived to begin the careful process of examining the scene. The skeletal remains were partially preserved in the sleeping compartment. After 104 years exposed to humidity, temperature fluctuations, and environmental factors, the preservation was far from complete. Many smaller bones, from hands, feet, and portions of the spine, were missing entirely, likely scattered by the partial roof collapse, water infiltration, or small animals over the decades. What remained were primarily the larger bones: skull, long bones from arms and legs, portions of the pelvis, and rib cage. Even these showed significant degradation, with surfaces that were porous and fragile from more than a century of deterioration. The position of what remained suggested the individual had been lying on what had been a sleeping berth, though the original arrangement had clearly been disturbed over time. Essentially, all organic material had long since decomposed completely. Clothing had deteriorated to the point where only metal components remained. Corroded buttons, buckles that had rusted to fragile shells, the metal frames of spectacles that crumbled when touched. Several items recovered with or near the remains provided potential identification clues. A pocket watch, gold, heavily corroded and no longer functional. After careful conservation work, engraving on the case became partially visible. CJT, and what appeared to be a date, though the final digits were too corroded to read with certainty. A signet ring, gold with heavy tarnish. The ring bore a crest that, after cleaning, showed distinctive features that might be identifiable through historical research. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains provided extremely limited information, as would be expected after more than a century of exposure. The individual was assessed as male based on remaining pelvic and skull features, though even this determination carried uncertainty given the degradation. Age at death was estimated broadly as middle-aged to elderly, though precise age determination was impossible due to the deteriorated condition of the bones. Height was very tentatively estimated at approximately 6 feet, based on measurements of the remaining long bones, but this too carried significant uncertainty. The skull showed some damage, but determining whether this occurred before or after death was scientifically impossible after 104 years. The damage could have resulted from pre-death trauma, from the partial roof collapse, from environmental pressure over decades, from falling debris, or from any combination of factors. Any suggestion that this damage represented pre-death violence would be pure speculation. Attempts were made at DNA analysis, given that living descendants of Christopher Thompson were located. However, after 104 years of exposure to fluctuating humidity, temperature extremes, and environmental contamination, DNA extraction from the skeletal remains proved largely unsuccessful. The genetic material was too degraded to provide reliable results. Some fragments were obtained, but forensic experts emphasized that these were insufficient for any definitive identification and that any apparent matches to descendant DNA should be viewed with extreme skepticism given the degraded sample quality. Historical research began immediately in parallel with the limited forensic work. The railcar's builder's plate, though heavily corroded, was partially legible, indicating construction in 1908 by a Pennsylvania railcar manufacturer. Company records archived in railway historical societies showed Christopher Thompson had commissioned a private railcar from that manufacturer in that year for a substantial sum. The contract, preserved in fading documents, included specifications that matched what could still be observed in the deteriorated railcar's construction. The initials CJT on the pocket watch matched Christopher James Thompson. The signet ring's crest, when compared to historical photographs of Christopher that showed him wearing such a ring, appeared consistent, though not identical enough to be definitive given the deterioration. The location of the railcar, on a private siding in a remote area that matched the general description Sullivan had given in 1919, provided circumstantial support. The very tentative height estimate from the skeletal remains, despite all its limitations, was not inconsistent with Christopher Thompson's recorded height of 6 feet. The broad age estimate of middle-aged to elderly was consistent with Christopher being 58 in 1919, but investigators emphasized repeatedly that, after 104 years, they could not provide scientific certainty about identification. No fingerprints remained. DNA was too degraded for reliable analysis. Dental records from 1919 no longer existed, and the skull's dental features were degraded. The physical evidence, the pocket watch, the ring, the rail car itself, the location, was all circumstantial. Based on the accumulation of circumstantial historical evidence, rather than definitive forensic proof, investigators tentatively concluded that the remains were most likely those of Christopher James Thompson. This conclusion rested primarily on context. The railcar was known to be his. The location was consistent with where his car had been taken in November 1919. The engraved pocket watch bore his initials, and the signet ring appeared similar to one he wore. But they acknowledged openly that absolute certainty was impossible, and would remain impossible given the extreme degradation of all physical evidence after more than a century. The discovery of skeletal remains in Christopher Thompson's private railcar, 104 years after his disappearance, provided some answers, but left far more questions permanently unresolved. The passage of more than a century had destroyed or degraded virtually all physical evidence that might have explained definitively what happened. What could be stated with reasonable confidence was minimal. Someone died in that rail car, probably decades ago. Based on the degree of skeletal degradation, the rail car had belonged to Christopher Thompson. Christopher had disappeared in November 1919 under mysterious circumstances involving his railcar being taken to a remote location. The circumstantial connection was strong, but that's all it was, circumstantial. The cause of death could not be determined. The forensic examination officially listed it as undetermined, with no further specification possible. The damage to the skull could not be proven to have occurred before death. It could equally well have resulted from the roof's partial collapse, from pressure over decades, from falling debris, or from any number of post-death factors. Anyone claiming the damage proved violence occurred would be speculating without scientific support. After 104 years, with everyone involved long deceased and most physical evidence deteriorated or lost completely, any reconstruction of events was necessarily speculative. But investigators and historians attempted to develop a theory of what might have occurred, while emphasizing repeatedly that this was speculation based on limited information, not established fact. Based on what little was known, the most plausible general scenario appeared to be: on November 14, 1919, Christopher Thompson left his office intending to travel to Albany. His private rail car was to be moved to the main line for this journey. Someone, whose identity remains completely unknown, apparently altered these plans by sending a false message to engineer Robert Sullivan. This message directed Sullivan to take the private car to a remote siding instead of the main line. Whether Christopher was in the rail car when Sullivan moved it to the remote location remains unknown. He may have been inside, expecting to be taken to the main line, or he may have been directed separately to meet someone at the remote siding, only entering the rail car once it was isolated in the forest. What happened at that remote location cannot be determined. Christopher may have been confronted, attacked, killed, or he may have died from natural causes, a heart attack, stroke, or other medical emergency, while in the rail car. The skull damage suggests violence might have occurred, but this cannot be proven and remains pure speculation. If violence was involved, whether it was premeditated murder or the result of a confrontation that escalated, cannot be known. If death was from natural causes, whether Christopher was alone or with someone who then fled, cannot be known. What is clear is that Christopher died in or on that rail car, and whoever knew about the situation chose not to report it. The rail car remained on the remote siding. Over the following weeks, when searches were conducted, the specific siding was never found despite extensive efforts. Whether this was due to Sullivan's inability to relocate it, to deliberate misdirection, to inadequate search methods, or to simple bad luck cannot be determined. Over the following months and years, the siding was forgotten. The spur line was abandoned. Vegetation grew over everything. Corporate records that might have specified the location precisely were lost in company mergers and reorganizations. The rail car vanished from human knowledge, sitting undisturbed for over a century. Who sent the false message to Sullivan? After 104 years, this question has no answer. The person Sullivan described as delivering the message was never identified. Whether that person acted alone or on behalf of others cannot be known. Several categories of suspects were theoretically possible. A business rival who arranged the false message to isolate Christopher for confrontation or murder. Someone involved in labor organizing who viewed Christopher as an enemy worth eliminating. An employee with a personal grudge who saw an opportunity for revenge. Someone Christopher knew personally who lured him to the remote location for reasons that died with everyone involved. But after 104 years, identifying any specific individual is impossible. Anyone who might have been involved would be deceased for decades. Records that might have provided clues are long gone. The complete truth vanished with those who experienced it. Could Christopher have staged his own disappearance? This theory seems unlikely given that he apparently died in the rail car, but even this cannot be stated with absolute certainty given forensic limitations. Could the entire scenario have been accidental? Christopher going to the remote location for legitimate reasons unknown to others, suffering a medical emergency there, and dying alone? Possible. But then why the false message to Sullivan? And why didn't Christopher tell anyone where he was actually going? The discovery brought closure of a sort to Christopher Thompson's descendants, his great-great-grandchildren, most of whom had known nothing beyond family. Stories about a railway magnate who mysteriously disappeared a century ago finally had at least the knowledge that he'd been found, even if the circumstances of his death remained murky. In August 2023, after forensic examination was complete, the skeletal remains were released to the family. On August 19th, Christopher James Thompson was buried in a cemetery in Philadelphia, in a plot next to Eleanor Thompson, his wife who died in 1947, never knowing what happened to him. The gravestone acknowledged the mystery. Christopher James Thompson, 1861 to 1919. Lost for 104 years. Finally at rest. The private rail car itself, despite its historical significance, was too deteriorated to preserve and relocate. The structure was documented extensively through photographs and measurements, then left in place to complete its slow decomposition in the forest. A historical marker was placed near the site noting its significance to railway history and the Thompson family story, though the exact location was not widely publicized to prevent vandalism. So what really happened to Christopher James Thompson? The honest answer is, we cannot know with certainty, and likely never will. Based on extremely limited and degraded evidence, we can say he probably died on, or shortly after November 14th, 1919. We can say his body remained in his private rail car on a remote, forgotten siding that was never found despite extensive searches in 1919 and 1920. We can say that changes in railway infrastructure, abandonment of spur lines, and forest growth gradually erased the location from maps and memory, hiding it for 104 years. What we cannot know is exactly how he died, whether violence was involved, who, if anyone, was responsible, or what specific sequence of events led to his death in that rail car. We cannot know if this was murder, accident, or natural death. We cannot identify any suspects. We cannot explain definitively why the rail car was taken to that specific location. These details died with everyone involved, buried as thoroughly by time as Christopher's remains were buried in that obscure forest clearing. The story of Christopher James Thompson is ultimately a reminder of how much can be lost to time. That physical evidence degrades and disappears. That even thorough investigations can fail when crucial evidence remains hidden. That infrastructure changes can erase locations completely. That mysteries which seem solvable can remain mysterious even when the missing are finally found. That sometimes the best we can achieve is a tentative conclusion based on circumstantial evidence, not the certainty we might wish for. After 104 years, Christopher Thompson has been found and can rest beside his wife. But the questions about exactly what happened in November 1919 and why will remain unanswered. The IB Forest kept his secret for over a century, and even after revealing where he was, it could not reveal how he came to be there or what his final hours were like. Some mysteries, it seems, time will never fully solve.